The Mafia boss ordered the black Maid to kneel. What happened next shattered the mansion. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character. Maria Williams was a quiet, unassuming woman in her mid-20s. Working as a maid in the sprawling mansion of the notorious Mafia boss, Johnny Russo, was not a life she had ever imagined for herself. But life had a way of leading her down paths she didn't choose. She had been raised in a small neighborhood in Chicago, far removed from the world of high society and power that Johnny Russo represented. From the moment she stepped foot in the mansion, Maria knew she was nothing more than a servant in the eyes of everyone here, especially the boss. Johnny Russo, with his commanding presence, exuded power in every room he entered. His eyes, cold and calculating, always seemed to look right through her as if she didn't exist. She had learned to keep her head down, stay out of the way, and never draw attention to herself. She had no choice. It was the only way to survive in a place where the elite and dangerous walked freely. But today was different. Today, something was about to change. Johnny Russo stood in front of her, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed her. He had just returned from a long day of business, and his temper was already frayed. He walked up to Maria with the air of someone who owned everything in sight, including her. "Kneel," he ordered coldly, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed without question. Maria felt her heart race. She had heard these kinds of orders before, but never so direct, so demeaning. She felt the familiar sting of humiliation creeping up her spine. Kneeling would mean submitting, acknowledging her place beneath him. But as she looked into his eyes, something inside her clicked. This wasn't just about power. It was about control. And she had been controlled for far too long. Slowly, Maria stood her ground, her posture straightening. She looked Johnny Russo squarely in the eye, her voice calm yet firm. "I won't kneel," she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her words. The room went silent. The usual hum of activity in the mansion seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound of her steady breathing and the tension hanging in the air. Johnny Russo, taken aback by her defiance, stepped closer, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. Maria held her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I said I won't kneel," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. Johnny's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. He had never expected this from her. Maria, the maid, the one he considered beneath him, was standing up to him. He had underestimated her. "You'll regret this," Johnny warned, his voice low and threatening. But Maria didn't flinch. She had made up her mind. This wasn't just about power anymore. It was about dignity, and she wasn't going to let him take that from her. The room remained still, the weight of the moment heavy on everyone present. Johnny Russo looked at her, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. But there was something else in his eyes now. Doubt. He had thought he could break her, like so many others before her. But Maria wasn't like the others. In that brief moment, he saw something he hadn't expected: strength. It wasn't physical. It wasn't in the way she stood or the words she spoke. It was in the quiet defiance in her eyes. He couldn't break her. Not like this. Johnny turned away, his jaw clenched tightly. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The message had been received. Maria had won, not through force, but through the quiet power of standing her ground. And from that moment on, things would never be the same. Maria stood in the middle of the room, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. The usual lavish ambience of the mansion felt cold, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Johnny Russo, the powerful Mafia boss who ruled over this place with an iron fist, stared at her in stunned silence. His eyes were wide with disbelief, not just from her defiance, but from something deeper, something that shook him to his core. Maria had stood up to him, and for the first time, he didn't know how to respond. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Maria's heart was pounding in her chest, but her face remained steady, her expression unwavering. The anger and humiliation she had lived with for years had finally come to a head, and in that moment, She knew she could not be broken. Johnny, standing there like a towering figure, had been the embodiment of power and control in her life. He had treated her as nothing more than an invisible servant, a mere shadow in his grand mansion. But now, he was the one who felt small. Maria wasn't going to let him, or anyone, dictate her worth. She wasn't going to kneel, not today, not ever. Slowly, Johnny composed himself, his eyes narrowing into a cold glare. "You think this is over?" he sneered, his voice low and threatening. Maria didn't flinch. She didn't back down. "It's over when I say it is," she replied calmly, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. Johnny's expression twisted into something darker, a mix of rage and disbelief. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. But even as he said those words, something inside him had shifted. He had never been challenged like this, not by anyone, especially not someone he considered to be beneath him. And that was what unnerved him the most. Maria stood there, unshaken, her gaze fixed firmly on him. She wasn't afraid. In fact, the fear that once gripped her heart had been replaced with something much stronger, determination. For so long, she had been silent, a ghost in the background, watching as those with power trampled over her. But not anymore. Johnny Russo might have had power, but Maria had something he didn't: integrity. The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. For a moment, no one moved. Johnny's gaze flickered to the men standing behind him, his loyal henchmen. But they, too, seemed unsure of what to do. They had all witnessed Johnny's power, but what they were seeing now was something they hadn't expected: a woman standing tall in the face of their boss's wrath, unyielding and resolute. Johnny's mind raced. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the rules. But Maria, this woman he had dismissed as just another servant, was making him question everything. Could it be that she knew something he didn't? Was she really as insignificant as he had believed? "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Johnny muttered, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful. Maria didn't respond. She didn't need to. The words weren't important. What mattered was that she had taken the first step toward claiming her own power. Johnny took a deep breath and looked away, as if trying to regain his composure. "Escort her out," he ordered flatly, his voice now devoid of the fury it had held moments before. But as the guards moved toward Maria, she didn't flinch. She didn't move. She stood tall, her head held high. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. Johnny froze, his eyes locking onto hers. The guards stopped in their tracks, unsure of what to do. Maria had spoken with such quiet strength. It was as if the very room had shifted its energy. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't just a servant. She was a force to be reckoned with. For a long moment, no one spoke. Johnny Russo stood there, his face a mask of confusion and frustration. He had no idea how to deal with this. The power he had wielded for so long had been challenged, not with violence, but with something far more powerful: self-respect. Johnny finally turned and left the room without another word. Maria stood there, still, her heart racing in her chest. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: free. It wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. As she stood in the mansion, the walls no longer felt as oppressive. The air was different now. Johnny Russo had tried to break her, but instead, he had set her free. Maria Williams had proven that no matter the power someone held over you, your dignity, your strength, and your voice could never be taken. It could only be given away. And Maria was never going to give it away again. The days that followed Maria's defiance were unlike any she had experienced before. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of Johnny Russo's mansion shift from a heavy, suffocating force to a space that, though still grand and imposing, no longer felt like a prison. Maria went about her duties with a quiet confidence that had been lacking in her life for so long. She moved through the halls with her head held high, no longer shrinking from the gaze of those who once treated her as invisible. The staff began to notice the change in her. The guards who once eyed her with disdain now seemed uncertain in her presence. They no longer treated her with the same indifference. Maria wasn't just another maid anymore. She had become someone who commanded respect, even without speaking a word. But Johnny Russo didn't forget what had happened. In fact, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He was a man used to control, a man who built his empire on power, intimidation, and fear. And yet, a maid, someone he considered beneath him, had the audacity to challenge him, to defy him in front of his own people. That was something he could not simply ignore. Days passed, and Johnny watched Maria from afar, his mind racing. He had been angry, furious even, when she stood up to him. But that anger was quickly replaced with something he hadn't expected: respect. She hadn't broken under his authority. She hadn't flinched. She had stood tall, calm, and unshaken, in a way that made him question his own actions. That made him wonder if he had been wrong. Johnny wasn't used to being questioned. He wasn't used to not getting what he wanted, especially from someone like Maria. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. He needed to see her again, to understand what had happened that day. But he didn't want to show weakness. He didn't want to admit that he had been moved by her. So he waited. Days turned into weeks, and still, Johnny didn't speak to her. He watched from the shadows, studying her every move, trying to find the answers that eluded him. Meanwhile, Maria remained unchanged. She didn't seek his approval, nor did she care if he noticed her. She had found something within herself that Johnny Russo could never give her: freedom. For the first time in her life, she was living on her own terms. The mansion no longer had a hold over her. She was no longer afraid of the power it represented. And Johnny Russo's silence only confirmed that she had won. One evening, as Maria was finishing her duties in the grand dining hall, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She already knew who it was. Maria. Johnny Russo's voice broke the stillness, deep and calm, with no hint of the anger that had once been there. Maria paused, but she didn't look at him. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice steady and composed. Johnny didn't say anything at first. He stood there, watching her, the weight of his gaze heavy on her shoulders. But it wasn't threatening. It was something different, something she had never seen from him before. "You're not what I thought you were," he said quietly. His words were not an insult, but an acknowledgement of something he couldn't deny. Maria finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I'm exactly who I've always been," she replied. Johnny nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not too proud to recognize when I'm wrong." For a moment, there was silence between them, a heavy silence filled with the weight of unspoken words. Maria had always believed that people like Johnny Russo would never change, that power and pride would always keep them locked in their ways. But here he was, admitting that he had been wrong. She didn't know what to say. She didn't need to say anything. Johnny took a step closer, his eyes locked with hers. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," he said softly, "but I am asking for a chance to make things right." Maria didn't answer right away. She studied him for a moment, her mind racing. Could she trust him? Could she believe that this was not just another manipulation? She had been betrayed before, by people who promised change but delivered nothing. But Johnny's words were different. There was no arrogance, no demand for submission. It was the first time she had heard him speak with humility, and for some reason, it made her pause. "You've already made things right," Maria said quietly, her voice steady. "By seeing me as more than just your maid." Johnny's eyes softened, the hardness that had once defined him replaced by something more vulnerable, more human. He nodded slowly, as if accepting her words, but still unsure of where to go from here. "Then maybe we start with that," he said. "Maybe we start with respect." Maria didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like the possibilities were hers to choose. The mansion, once a symbol of her oppression, had become a place where she could stand tall, not as a servant, but as someone who had the power to shape her own destiny. And Johnny Russo, the man who once sought to control her, had just begun to understand what real power truly meant. Maria's life began to shift in ways she hadn't expected. Johnny Russo's unexpected display of humility had left her unsettled, yet oddly empowered. She had never seen him like this before, not the confident, untouchable figure she had grown accustomed to. The man who once made her feel small was now standing before her with a rare vulnerability, something that caused her to question the foundations of everything she thought she knew about power and control. The days following their conversation were quiet. The mansion felt different, and so did she. Maria was still doing her work, cleaning, serving, and organizing, but there was an unspoken change in the air. She walked through the halls with a new sense of purpose, no longer just a silent observer of the chaos that swirled around her. The guards, once indifferent to her presence, now gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement as she passed. It was subtle, but it was something. And that something made her realize how much had changed, not just in the mansion, but within herself. Johnny didn't speak to her much after that day, but when he did, it was different. It wasn't the cold orders he used to give. It wasn't the demeaning tones or the condescending looks. Now, when their paths crossed, he would nod, ask if she needed anything, and even offer a quiet thank you when she completed a task. It was strange, disorienting even, to be treated with respect by the very man who had once made her feel so invisible. But Maria wasn't sure if she should trust it. People changed, yes, but did they really change? Or were they just wearing a different mask to get what they wanted? As much as she had wanted to believe that Johnny's shift was genuine, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this was all just another game. A new way for him to gain control over her, to manipulate her without her realizing it. But there was something in the way he looked at her now that made her think it wasn't all a facade. The lingering respect, the quiet moments of acknowledgement, felt real, like something he had never given anyone before. Maria wasn't sure how to process it. She was used to playing the role of the silent servant, never drawing attention to herself, never questioning the status quo. But now, she found herself standing at the edge of something unknown, something bigger than just cleaning rooms and serving drinks. It was the possibility of a life where she had the power to choose, to define who she was, and to no longer let others define her worth. One evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, Johnny Russo called for Maria. This time, it wasn't to give an order or to dismiss her. He simply asked her to join him in the library. Maria hesitated for a moment. It wasn't unusual for Johnny to want company, but it was rare that he called for her specifically. Still, she walked down the long corridor that led to the library, her footsteps soft against the marble floors. When she entered, Johnny was sitting by the fire, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Maria," he said, his voice low but warm, "I need to apologize for how I've treated you. For everything. You didn't deserve any of it." Maria didn't know how to respond. The apology, if it could even be called that, was unexpected. She had been waiting for him to turn it into a game, to twist it into some kind of power play. But he didn't. He just sat there, his face solemn, his eyes sincere. "I've spent my life making people fear me," Johnny continued, his voice steady. "But I've learned that fear doesn't get you loyalty. It gets you compliance. And there's a difference." Maria still said nothing. She wasn't sure what to make of his words. She had heard plenty of people apologize before, only to go right back to their old ways. But there was something different about Johnny's tone. There was a quiet honesty in it that made her listen. "You've shown me something I didn't know I was missing," Johnny added, looking at her now. "You've shown me that there's strength in standing your ground, in not being afraid to speak your truth. And for that, I owe you more than just an apology." Maria finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I'm not looking for anything from you, Johnny," she said. "I never was. I was just trying to survive. And now, I'm learning to live." Johnny's expression softened. "I understand," he said, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity. "But I want you to know that things are different now. I'm different." Maria took a slow breath, processing his words. She wasn't sure if she believed him completely, but she knew one thing for certain. The game was changing. And for the first time in a long time, Maria felt like she might actually be able to choose her own role in it. The fire crackled softly in the background as they sat in silence, neither of them speaking for a long while. For once, the mansion didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a place where anything was possible, even freedom. The days passed quietly in the mansion, and with each one, Maria found herself slowly letting go of the past. Johnny Russo's apology had been unexpected, but it had made something stir within her, a quiet hope that perhaps the world was capable of change, and that maybe, just maybe, she could start to trust again. She had never allowed herself to dream beyond the confines of this mansion, but with every passing day, she began to think differently. Johnny's words, his promise of respect, weren't just empty gestures. They were backed by actions, small but significant. The guards, who once glared at her as she passed, now greeted her with respectful nods. The other staff members, who had once whispered about her, now exchanged glances that held no malice, only curiosity. Johnny had made it clear that things were different now, and the mansion, once a symbol of her oppression, had started to feel like a place of possibility. Maria continued her duties, but she no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt like a mere pawn in Johnny's game. It was as if, in standing up to him, she had reclaimed her voice, and the walls of the mansion no longer seemed to close in around her. Johnny, too, had changed. He no longer spent his days with the same cold detachment. Maria could see it in the way he interacted with the staff, in the way he moved through the mansion. There was no longer an air of arrogance about him. Instead, there was a quiet resolve, a desire to do better, not just for himself, but for those around him. It was a change that Maria hadn't expected, but one that she had come to appreciate. One evening, as the sun began to set, Johnny called for her again. Maria, having grown used to his quiet respect, didn't hesitate to walk to his office. She had grown accustomed to the new dynamic between them, and the walls that once kept them apart now felt less oppressive. When she entered the room, Johnny was standing by the window, his back to her, staring out at the grounds. He turned as she entered, his eyes meeting hers. "Maria," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a hint of something more. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About what you said. About what I said." Maria said nothing, but she nodded slightly, indicating she was listening. Johnny sighed, his shoulders slumping just a little. "I've spent so much of my life hiding behind power and control. I thought that was all I needed. But you showed me that it's not enough. Not for anything that really matters." Maria took a step forward, her voice soft. "You don't have to explain yourself to me, Johnny. I've seen what you're capable of. But this is your life. You're the one who has to live with your choices." Johnny met her gaze and nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've hurt people along the way. But I want to change. I want to do better. And I think you're the only one who can help me." Maria didn't respond immediately. She didn't know what to say. She had seen this kind of thing before, the promises of change, the desires for redemption. But she had also seen the lies, the manipulations. She wasn't sure if she could trust Johnny, not completely. But something in his eyes made her want to believe him. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Her voice steady. Johnny took a deep breath before responding. "I want you to help me change. I want you to stay. I don't know how to make up for everything I've done, but I'm asking for the chance to try." Maria looked at him for a long moment, her mind racing. She had always believed that power came from dominance, from taking control of others. But Johnny was asking her to help him relinquish control, to help him become someone better. It was a vulnerability she had never expected from him. "I'm not sure how much I can help you," Maria said quietly. "But I can try." Johnny's face softened, and for the first time, Maria saw a glimpse of the man behind the facade, a man who was tired of carrying the weight of his own mistakes. "That's all I'm asking for," he replied. There was silence between them, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, with the recognition that things could be different, that people could change. Maria nodded slowly. "Then let's see what happens," she said. The days that followed were filled with small changes, moments of progress. Johnny was more present, more involved in the day-to-day operations of the mansion. He no longer demanded blind obedience from the staff. Instead, he listened to them, took their input, and began to act with more humility. Maria, too, began to see the world around her differently. She no longer felt like a prisoner of her circumstances. The mansion, once a symbol of her powerlessness, had transformed into a place where she could finally breathe, where she could finally be herself. Johnny Russo, the Mafia boss who had once been a figure of intimidation, was becoming someone else, a man who had learned the hard way that true power didn't come from fear, but from respect. And Maria, the woman who had once been just a servant in his world, had become someone who had the power to change it. As the weeks passed, Maria continued to observe Johnny from a distance. There was a noticeable difference in the way he carried himself now, a subtle shift that made her see him in a new light. He was no longer the ruthless Mafia boss she had once feared. The arrogance had melted away, replaced by something more grounded, more human. The changes were small at first, but they were there. Johnny now took time to listen to others, to seek advice from those who had once been beneath him. He even made a point to thank Maria for her work, something he had never done before. It was these small gestures that made Maria wonder if the man she had once despised was capable of becoming someone different. But despite these changes, Maria remained cautious. She had seen people change before, but she had also seen them return to their old ways. Trust was something that couldn't be given lightly, especially when it had been broken so many times. Johnny seemed to understand this. He no longer expected anything from her, other than her presence. He had stopped trying to force her into submission, stopped trying to make her feel small. He treated her with a respect she had never known from him, and that respect began to change the dynamic in the mansion. Maria no longer felt like a prisoner in her own life. She could walk through the halls with her head held high, no longer avoiding the gaze of the people around her. The mansion, once a symbol of oppression, had transformed into a place where she could finally breathe, where she could finally stand tall. Johnny, too, had changed. He had begun to question everything he had built his life on. The power, the fear, the control. He had come to realize that none of it mattered if there was no respect, no genuine connection with the people around him. And he knew that Maria, the woman he had once treated as insignificant, was the one who had shown him the truth. One evening, Johnny called for Maria again. This time, she didn't hesitate to meet him. She had come to realize that the changes in him were real, and she was no longer afraid of what might happen. When she entered the room, Johnny was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the sprawling grounds. He turned as she walked in, his face soft, devoid of the hardness that had once defined him. "Maria," he said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of uncertainty. "I've been thinking about everything. About us." Maria nodded, waiting for him to continue. Johnny walked toward her slowly, as though unsure of what to say next. "I've been living in this mansion for years," he began, "but I've never really understood what it means to live until now. I've spent so much time building walls around myself, thinking that power and control were the only things that mattered. But you showed me that there's more to life than that." Maria listened quietly, her eyes fixed on him. She had always been a good listener, but now, she felt like she was hearing him for the first time. Johnny's voice had softened, and there was a sincerity in his words that made her believe he wasn't just speaking to fill the silence. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he continued, "but I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've shown me. You've made me realize that respect, trust, and kindness are worth more than anything I've ever had." Maria felt a stir of emotion in her chest. She had never expected this from Johnny. She had expected him to continue down the same path of arrogance and power, never questioning his own actions. But here he was, acknowledging his mistakes, admitting that he had been wrong. It was a humbling moment. "I'm not asking for anything from you," Johnny said, his voice low, "but I want to give you the respect you deserve. I want to make things right." Maria took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what to say. She had spent so many years guarding herself, keeping her emotions hidden behind walls of defense. But something in Johnny's words, in the sincerity in his eyes, made her want to believe in the possibility of change. "I don't know if things can ever go back to the way they were," Maria said softly, her voice steady. "But I do know this, people can change. And if you're really willing to change, then maybe we can find a way to move forward." Johnny nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's all I'm asking for," he replied. The silence between them lingered for a moment, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with possibility, with the recognition that both of them had the power to shape their own futures. The following days were filled with more moments of understanding between them. Johnny continued to show humility and respect, never pushing Maria beyond what she was willing to give. He gave her space, allowed her to be herself without expecting anything in return. And in return, Maria allowed herself to trust him, little by little. It wasn't easy. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. But every day, Johnny proved himself to be a man of his word, someone who was truly trying to change. And Maria, though still cautious, began to believe that maybe this time, change was possible. The mansion, once a place of fear and submission, had transformed into something else, a space where respect, trust, and understanding could flourish. And for the first time in a long time, Maria felt like she was finally free, not just from the walls of the mansion, but from the chains of her own doubts and fears. Johnny Russo had changed, but so had she. Together, they were rewriting the rules of the game, one step at a time. As the weeks stretched into months, the quiet understanding between Maria and Johnny grew stronger. The mansion, once a place of secrets and tension, had transformed into something more. It was no longer just a building filled with walls of opulence and power. Now, it was a space where Maria could breathe freely, where Johnny's presence no longer cast a shadow over her. Johnny had changed, there was no doubt about that. His actions spoke louder than words, and day by day, he showed that the man who once ruled with fear and intimidation was now seeking redemption, seeking respect. But the real shift wasn't just in him. Maria had changed too. She had come to realize that her own strength wasn't just about standing her ground against those who wronged her. It was about choosing her path, choosing how she responded to the world around her. Johnny had shown her that power didn't always come from domination. Sometimes, it came from humility, from owning up to mistakes and making the decision to be better. And in that decision, Maria found her own voice. The changes didn't go unnoticed. The other staff, who had once been silent observers of the tension between the boss and his maid, began to take note of the subtle shifts. The quiet nods of acknowledgement that Johnny now gave Maria became a sign of the transformation within him. It wasn't just about the way he treated her. It was about the way he treated everyone with a newfound respect. And for Maria, it was no longer just about surviving the mansion. She no longer felt like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong in the spaces she walked through. The mansion had become her space too. But even as things seemed to settle, Maria knew that nothing could remain perfect forever. There would always be challenges, always be tests. And so, one evening, Johnny called her into his office again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She had come to trust the man who had once been a stranger to her. When she entered, Johnny was standing by the window once more, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned as she entered, offering a faint smile. "Maria," he said, his voice warm but serious. "I've been thinking." Maria stood silently, waiting for him to continue. Johnny looked out the window, his gaze distant. "I know things have been different between us, and I want to make sure it stays that way," he said. "But there's something I need to ask of you." Maria raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in his tone. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady. Johnny hesitated for a moment, his eyes lingering on her before he spoke. "There's a matter I'm dealing with. A situation in my business that I need help navigating. I don't want to go into details just yet, but I trust you, Maria, and I need you to help me with this." Maria didn't respond immediately. She had learned to be cautious, even with Johnny's newfound humility. She had seen people promise change, only to revert to old habits when the pressure was on. "What kind of help do you need?" she asked carefully. Johnny looked at her with sincerity. "I need someone who can think outside the box, someone who can see things from a different perspective. You've shown me that you have that ability. And right now, I need you more than I've ever needed anyone before." Maria considered his words. She had always prided herself on her ability to read people, to understand their motivations. Johnny's request wasn't just about business. It was about trust. He was asking her to be part of something that went beyond her role in the mansion, beyond the walls that had once confined her. "I'm not sure what this is all about, Johnny," she said slowly, "but I'll help you. On one condition." Johnny raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's the condition?" Maria stood tall, her voice steady. "That you never go back to the way things were. That you keep your word, not just to me, but to everyone here. If you can do that, then I'll help you." Johnny's expression softened. "I'll do my best," he promised. "That's all I can ask." The decision was made. Maria had chosen to trust him, but this time, it wasn't about submitting to his power. It was about standing alongside him, helping him navigate the challenges he faced. The mansion no longer felt like a place of tension. It was a place where change was happening, where both Maria and Johnny were learning from each other, growing in ways they never expected. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Maria felt like she was on the right path. Johnny's redemption was just beginning, and for the first time, she could see that it was real. And as they stood together in the mansion that had once been a symbol of their conflict, they both knew that their journey was far from over. But it was a journey they were ready to face, together. Weeks passed, and the mansion began to feel like a different place entirely. Johnny's request for Maria's help had marked a turning point. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about mutual respect, about building something new between them. Maria had taken on the task he'd asked of her, and though she didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, she knew it was important. She could see the weight of it in Johnny's eyes. But her trust was still cautious. She was no longer the woman who just survived in the background. She was part of something now, something that had the potential to change everything, not just for Johnny, but for herself as well. Johnny, for his part, seemed to appreciate Maria's cautiousness. He knew he had no right to expect her complete trust, not after everything that had happened between them. But there was something in the way she helped him that told him she was starting to believe, even if just a little, that he was changing for the better. The work was grueling, but it was something different. It wasn't the kind of work that made Maria feel small or invisible. It was important, meaningful. She saw Johnny in a new light, too. He wasn't the same man who had once made her feel beneath him. He was learning, trying to do better. And for the first time, Maria believed him. One afternoon, as they were going over the details of the plan they were working on, Johnny asked her to join him for a walk through the estate. The crisp fall air had a coolness to it, the kind of chill that hinted at the changing seasons. As they walked through the gardens, Johnny spoke. Maria, I've been thinking a lot about what comes next. This thing we're working on, it's just the beginning. I'm not blind to the fact that I have a lot to make up for. And I know it's not going to happen overnight. But I want you to know something. I'm committed to this. To us. Maria didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to show that she was listening, that she understood the weight of what he was saying. Johnny glanced at her, his face serious, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I want you to know that I'm doing this not just for myself, he continued, but for you, too. You've given me something I didn't think I could have. You've shown me that it's possible to build something better, to be a better person, and I'm not going to let that go. Maria could feel the sincerity in his words. It was hard to deny. Johnny had spent so long holding on to his power, his control, thinking it was the only thing that mattered. But now, he was standing in front of her, admitting that there was more to life than that. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Johnny said, breaking the silence between them. And I know I don't deserve your trust, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be different, that I can be someone you can rely on. Maria stopped walking and turned to face him. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained steady. I don't know what the future holds, she said, quietly, but I do know this. I won't give up on the possibility of change. Not for you, not for anyone. Johnny nodded slowly, as if understanding what she meant. He had already taken the first step by acknowledging his past mistakes. But Maria knew that it would take more than words to rebuild trust. It would take time. That's all I can ask for, he said. Time. And the chance to prove that I can be someone who deserves that trust. As they walked back toward the mansion, Maria felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She had been hesitant to trust Johnny, to believe that he could truly change. But now, she felt something different. There was a small spark of hope, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. When they returned to the mansion, the world outside felt a little less cold. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in. For the first time, the mansion felt like a place where something new could grow. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was progress. And that was enough for now. Maria didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like it was something she could shape. Johnny had taken the first step toward redemption, and she had chosen to walk beside him. There would be challenges ahead, of course. There always were. But Maria was no longer afraid. She had faced her fears, stood up to the man who had once ruled her life with power and intimidation. And now, she was standing alongside him as an equal, ready to face whatever came next. And that, in itself, was a victory. The following weeks in the mansion felt like a new beginning, a slow but steady shift in the way life unfolded. Johnny and Maria worked side by side, the air between them charged with the quiet understanding that they were both still learning, still finding their footing. Johnny had been true to his word. His actions, though small, spoke volumes. He sought her input, treated her with respect, and slowly, the mansion that had once been a place of dominance and fear was transforming into something that felt more like a home than a prison. The mansion's walls, once intimidating and cold, now seemed to hold an unspoken promise of change. Johnny was no longer the tyrant he once was. His power, once fueled by fear, now had a different source, a desire for redemption. It was a subtle shift, but one that was felt deeply by the people around him. Maria, however, still kept her guard up. She had been through enough in her life to know that change, even when genuine, was often a slow and uncertain process. Trust was something that couldn't be given lightly, especially when it had been broken so many times before. But she was beginning to see the sincerity in Johnny's actions. She had seen the man who had ruled with an iron fist and the man who was now quietly working to make amends. It was a contrast she hadn't expected, but one that she was beginning to accept. One afternoon, as Maria worked in the kitchen, Johnny came in. It had become a familiar scene, but today there was something different in the way he looked at her. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now held something else, something softer. "Maria," he said, his voice steady but carrying a note of something deeper. "There's something I need to discuss with you." Maria, who had been chopping vegetables, paused for a moment. She had gotten used to his quiet presence, but the seriousness in his tone made her set down the knife and turn to face him. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with curiosity. Johnny sighed, a deep breath escaping him as he ran a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking about the future, about what comes next for us, for the mansion, for the people who work here." Maria listened quietly, her gaze steady. She knew that Johnny had been working on some new projects, some that required careful planning and attention. But this was different. There was an earnestness in his words, a vulnerability that caught her off guard. "I don't want to just change the way things are here," Johnny continued, his voice lower now. "I want to change for good, and I want you to be a part of that. I need you to help me. Help me make sure that what we're building here isn't just another cycle of control, but something better, something real." Maria was silent for a long moment. She had seen Johnny at his worst, had seen him use power to manipulate and control. But now, she was seeing a different side of him, one that was willing to admit his faults and take responsibility for his actions. He was asking for her help, not out of manipulation, but because he genuinely wanted to change. And for the first time, Maria felt something shift inside her. It was a small thing, a quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, Johnny Russo was someone worth trusting. "What exactly do you want me to help with?" she asked, her voice steady. Johnny's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, Maria saw a man who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. "I want to create a space here where everyone is treated with respect," he said, "where no one is above anyone else. I want to make sure the people who work here, who take care of this place, are valued, not just as workers, but as people. I've never cared about that before. I've only cared about power, but I see now that that's not enough." Maria nodded slowly. She had heard words like these before, promises of change that never amounted to anything. But there was something in Johnny's eyes that made her believe him, just for a moment. "I'll help you," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "But it won't be easy. Change takes time, and it takes trust." Johnny nodded, his expression softening. "I know," he said, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The days that followed were filled with more discussions, more plans. Johnny and Maria worked together to lay the groundwork for the changes they both wanted to see. It wasn't always easy. There were obstacles, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But there was also progress. The staff, once wary of Johnny's intentions, began to see the difference in the way he interacted with them. He listened to their concerns, took their suggestions seriously, and for the first time, they felt like they had a voice. Maria's role in this new dynamic became clear. She wasn't just Johnny's confidant. She was someone who could help him shape the future, someone who could ensure that the changes they were making were real, not just superficial gestures. As the weeks passed, Johnny continued to prove that he was committed to change. The mansion, once a symbol of his power, began to reflect the values he was now trying to instill: respect, humility, and trust. But Maria knew that they couldn't stop here. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more tests to face. But for the first time, she felt like they were both on the right path. Johnny Russo had changed, but so had she. They had both learned that true power didn't come from control. It came from understanding, from listening, from the willingness to grow. And together, they were learning how to build something better. Something that, for the first time, felt like it could last. The days felt like they were slipping into a new rhythm, one that was quieter, more thoughtful, but no less intense. Johnny's transformation was no longer a question of if, but how far. Every decision, every action, no matter how small, seemed to hold more meaning. Maria had noticed it in him. The way he approached the staff with care, the way he took responsibility for his mistakes, and the way he began to encourage those around him to do the same. The mansion, once a fortress of wealth and power, now echoed with the sounds of change, of honest conversations, of planning for a future where respect was no longer a privilege, but a given. But with change came challenges. It wasn't just about earning trust, it was about keeping it. And Maria, though she had begun to believe in Johnny's sincerity, couldn't help but remain cautious. She had been through too much, seen too many people promise change only to fall back into their old ways. Trust was fragile, and it took time to rebuild what had been broken. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Johnny called her into his office. The familiar feeling of anticipation settled in Maria's chest. It was the same way she had felt when she first started working in the mansion, when every encounter with him had been a tense, calculating game. But now, that feeling was different. It was no longer about survival. It was about progress. Johnny stood by the large window, staring out at the grounds. He had always been a man who preferred to keep his thoughts to himself, but now, he looked different. There was a quiet weight to him, as if the shift in his life had settled deep into his bones. "Maria," he began, his voice steady but carrying a note of uncertainty. "I've been thinking about everything, about how far we've come, and how far we still have to go." Maria didn't say anything, but she nodded, signaling that she was listening. Johnny turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers with a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I don't expect you to have all the answers," he said. "But I need to ask for something that I've been thinking about for a long time. Something I've never asked before." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the words, "I need you," from Johnny before, but it had always been in the context of his demands, his expectations. This time, it felt different. "What is it?" she asked, her voice quiet, her gaze steady. Johnny took a deep breath. "I need you to help me make sure I don't fall back into the same patterns. I don't want to lose what we've built here, what we've started. But I know I can't do it alone." Maria's mind raced. She had never expected to hear him say this. He, the man who had once believed that power and control were the only things worth fighting for, now asking for help in staying true to the changes he had promised. It was humbling, and it made her realize how far he had come. "Johnny," Maria said softly, taking a step forward, "you've already done the hardest part. You've started this change within yourself. The rest is just about consistency. It's about making the right choices every day, even when no one is watching." Johnny nodded, his expression serious. "I know," he said quietly, "but I'm scared. I've spent so long hiding behind walls that I don't know how to live without them. Without control." Maria studied him, her heart softening. She had seen the fear in him before, but this time, it wasn't the kind of fear that sought to dominate. It was the fear of vulnerability, of letting go of the power he had clung to for so long. "You don't have to do it alone, Johnny," Maria said, her voice steady. "You have the strength to keep going. But you have to trust the people around you. You have to trust that change is real. And you have to trust yourself." Johnny looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then, finally, he nodded. "I will," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm learning. And I'll keep learning. With you." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but a comfortable kind of quiet. One that held an understanding that neither of them had to say anything more. Maria had made her peace with her decision. She had trusted Johnny with her belief that he could change, and he had proved her right. She knew that there were still challenges ahead. There always would be. But for the first time, she felt like they were walking in the right direction, together. As the night deepened, they stood in the quiet of the office, looking out at the stars, knowing that no matter what came next, they had taken the first step towards something new. The mansion, once a place of isolation, now felt like a place of possibilities. Johnny had found something he had long forgotten, the power of redemption. And Maria had found something, too, the courage to believe in it. Together, they were learning how to move forward, how to build a future based not on control, but on understanding, not on fear, but on trust. It was just the beginning, but for the first time, it felt like a future they could create together. The weeks that followed brought about even more change, though it was clear that the road ahead was not without its bumps. Johnny's transformation, though steady, was still a work in progress, and there were moments when old habits tried to resurface. However, Maria could see that the man she had once feared was gradually becoming someone different, someone who was willing to confront his past and take responsibility for his actions. The mansion, which had once been a place of cold authority and rigid hierarchy, now felt more like a place of collaboration. Johnny made it clear to the staff that their voices mattered, and for the first time, Maria noticed that their contributions were taken seriously. But there was still work to be done, not just in the mansion, but in the trust between Johnny and those who had been most affected by his earlier actions. Maria, too, was learning. She had to constantly remind herself that trust wasn't something that could be easily handed over. It was earned, and she had already given Johnny a piece of it, but it would take time to offer him all of it. Still, she couldn't deny that things felt different. The atmosphere in the mansion was lighter, even during the long meetings about the future of the estate. Johnny's demeanor, once commanding and demanding, had become more open, more thoughtful. He no longer expected blind obedience from anyone. He invited suggestions, asked for opinions, and, on many occasions, sat down with Maria to discuss how they could create a future that would benefit everyone. It was clear that he valued her input, but what was even more telling was the way he had begun to value everyone in the mansion, not just as workers, but as people. Maria's role had changed, too. She had become more involved in the decision-making process, not just as someone who was doing the work, but as someone whose thoughts were sought out and considered. She didn't know what had changed in her to make her feel like she had earned a seat at the table, but she knew that Johnny had given her that space. It was a quiet, unspoken shift that had happened between them, but it had been monumental. One evening, Johnny invited her into the study. This time, it wasn't about a business plan or an issue that needed solving. It was something else. Maria was curious as to what it might be. As she walked into the room, Johnny was sitting behind his desk, his usual calm presence there, but something about his posture indicated that this conversation would be different. "Maria," he began, his voice steady but with a hint of vulnerability. "There's something I want to ask of you. I've been thinking a lot about where we are, where I am, and how far we've come. But I know there's still more to do." Maria took a seat in front of his desk, giving him her full attention. She could sense the weight of his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft but inquisitive. Johnny leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Maria. I don't think I deserve it. But I've realized that the work I need to do doesn't stop with my actions. It goes deeper than that. I need to rebuild what's broken inside me, not just fix the outside. And I want to make sure that, moving forward, we're not just building a better mansion, a better business, but a better life. A life where I can be the kind of man who truly deserves the respect I've been given." Maria listened carefully. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, the struggle he was facing as he tried to reconcile the man he had been with the man he wanted to be. It wasn't easy, and she knew that. It had taken years for him to get to this point, and it wouldn't be fixed overnight. But in his words, there was something she hadn't heard before. Real remorse, not just for his past actions, but for the man he had allowed himself to become. "Johnny," Maria said, her voice gentle, "you're already doing it. The change, the effort, it's visible. You don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to prove anything to me. What matters is that you're trying, and that you're doing the work, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's been part of this journey with you." Johnny looked at her, his expression softening. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully make up for the past, Maria. But I'll keep trying. For you, for the mansion, for everyone who's been affected by the choices I've made." Maria nodded, understanding that this was something that couldn't be solved with a few words or gestures. It would take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. But for the first time, she saw a man who was ready to face his demons and make the hard choices to become someone better. And that was all she could ask for. The room was quiet for a long moment as they both sat there, allowing the weight of their conversation to settle. Johnny didn't speak right away. Neither did Maria. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of understanding, a moment of acknowledgement that they had both come a long way. Johnny had changed, and Maria was beginning to believe that this change was real. But even as things seemed to be heading in the right direction, Maria knew that the journey was far from over. Trust wasn't a simple thing to give. It was fragile, easily broken, and once lost, it could be hard to rebuild. But with every action, with every decision Johnny made, he was proving that he was willing to do the work. And, for the first time, Maria found herself believing in the possibility of a future where the past didn't define them. They had started something together, something neither of them had expected, and neither of them knew exactly what it would look like in the end. But as they sat there, in the quiet of the study, Maria realized that she was no longer afraid of the future. She was ready to face it. The days grew warmer as spring began to make its presence known, and with the changing season, the dynamics of the mansion continued to evolve. The shift in Johnny's behavior was becoming more ingrained in the way he carried himself. He no longer just nodded at the staff in passing. He made an effort to connect with them, to learn about their lives and their needs. The mansion, once a place of rigid hierarchy and tension, was now filled with something that Maria had never thought possible, an atmosphere of collaboration and mutual respect. But as with all transformations, there were moments of doubt. Maria, though she had come to trust Johnny more than she ever thought she would, still had her reservations. She had seen enough to know that change was rarely permanent, and that even the smallest slip could undo months of progress. So, while she was no longer afraid of what Johnny might do, she remained cautious, careful to not lose sight of who she was in the process. Johnny, for his part, was aware of the fragility of the trust he had gained. He was under no illusion that everything was perfect or that the mansion's problems had been solved. But he had come to realize that his own redemption was a journey, not a destination, and he was willing to walk it, no matter how long it took. Maria had become an anchor for him, someone who not only understood the weight of his past, but who was willing to help him face it. They had come to an understanding, a silent agreement that they would help each other along the way. It was a partnership, not in the traditional sense, but one born out of mutual respect. One evening, Johnny called for Maria again. This time, the tone of his voice wasn't serious, but more thoughtful, almost reflective. Maria had come to expect these quiet conversations, the ones that carried weight but weren't about business or the mansion's affairs. She made her way to his office, where she found him seated at his desk, a glass of water in front of him and a stack of papers scattered around. "Maria," Johnny said as she entered, looking up from his desk. "I've been thinking." He didn't seem troubled, but there was something in his demeanor that told her this wasn't just another casual conversation. "About what?" she asked, sitting down across from him. Johnny leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant as he thought for a moment. "About how far we've come, I guess," he said. "I've been thinking about all of this, the changes, the work we've done together. And I can't help but wonder what comes next. We've started something here, something real, but what do we do with it now?" Maria was silent for a moment, taking in his words. She had thought about that too, in her quieter moments. What came next? What did they build upon this foundation they had created? "I think we keep going," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "We keep building, one step at a time. There's no rush. It's a process, and it's about staying true to what we've started." Johnny nodded slowly, taking in her words. He seemed to consider them for a long moment before speaking again. "I know. I think the hardest part is realizing that it's not just about the big changes. It's the small things, the daily choices, that really matter. I've spent so much of my life looking for shortcuts, ways to make things happen quickly, but I'm starting to see that it's all about consistency. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching." Maria smiled slightly, her eyes softening. "It's the little things that matter most," she said. "And I think you're starting to understand that." Johnny's gaze met hers, and for a moment, there was a silence that spoke volumes. He wasn't the man he had been. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he spoke, in the way he was beginning to live his life. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. "I've made mistakes," Johnny said quietly, "a lot of them. But I'm trying. I really am. And I'm hoping that, in time, I can make up for what I've done, for what I put you through." Maria's expression softened. "You don't have to make up for anything, Johnny. The fact that you're trying, that you're doing the work to be better, that's what matters. I've seen enough to know that it's real." Johnny smiled faintly, but there was something heavier in his gaze. "It's not just about me," he said. It's about all of us, the people who've been affected by my choices. I want to make sure that what we're building here is a place where everyone is valued, where we can all grow together. I don't want this to just be my redemption. I want it to be something bigger. Maria nodded. She understood. It will be, she said quietly. But it starts with you. And it starts with each of us making the choice to be better every day. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding. Johnny had changed. Maria had changed. And now, they were ready to move forward, together. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But it would be real. And that was all they could ask for. The mansion, once a symbol of power and fear, was now a symbol of something else. Of hope, of redemption, of the possibility of change. They had started something together, and now, there was no turning back. Months had passed, and the mansion had changed in ways Maria had never imagined possible. The air was lighter, the staff more at ease, and Johnny's presence no longer loomed as a symbol of power and intimidation. Instead, he had become something else, a man who sought to create something genuine, something real. It wasn't just about the mansion anymore. It was about building a life, one that was not defined by control, but by respect and understanding. Maria had always been cautious, never fully trusting anyone, especially those who had the power to hurt her. But Johnny had proven himself time and time again, showing that his transformation wasn't just a temporary shift. He was changing, and he was committed to making sure the mansion reflected that change. As the seasons passed, Maria found herself becoming more involved in the decisions that shaped their world. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a partner in this transformation, her voice valued in the conversations that shaped the future of the mansion. Johnny had made it clear from the beginning that he wanted to build something that wasn't just about his redemption. It was about everyone's growth. And Maria, with all her doubts and caution, had become an integral part of that vision. One evening, as the sun set behind the mansion's towering walls, Maria stood by the window, looking out at the estate. The world beyond seemed to reflect the calm that had settled within her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, thriving in a place where she had once felt trapped. The mansion had become a symbol of possibility, not just for Johnny, but for her as well. Johnny entered the room quietly, his footsteps barely audible on the marble floors. He had changed, but so had she. The man who had once controlled everything with fear and intimidation was now someone who sought to listen, to learn, to grow. Maria, Johnny said softly, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. I've been thinking about everything we've done, everything we've built. And I wanted to thank you. Maria turned to face him, her eyes steady. You've done the work, Johnny. I'm just here, helping where I can. Johnny shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. No, you've done more than that. You've helped me see the world differently. You've helped me see myself differently. Maria felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had always thought of herself as a survivor, never really allowing anyone to get close. But with Johnny, it was different. She had seen the potential for change, not just in him, but in herself. She had allowed herself to believe that people could change. We've both changed, she said softly. Johnny nodded, his gaze thoughtful. I never thought I'd get here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who would listen, who would care about the people around him. But here I am, trying. Maria stepped closer to him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen the man who had ruled with fear, the man who had tried to control every part of his world. And now, she was seeing the man who was ready to let go of that control and build something better. You're doing it, Maria said. And that's all that matters. Johnny's eyes softened, and for the first time, Maria saw a man who wasn't trying to hide behind his past, but was willing to face it and make something better of it. I don't know what the future holds, Maria, Johnny said, his voice low. But I know that I want you by my side as we continue this journey. Maria looked at him, her heart filled with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time, she felt like she was a part of something that was worth fighting for. I'm with you, Maria said quietly, her voice steady. Wherever this goes, I'm with you. The silence between them was filled with understanding. They had both come a long way. Johnny had built his empire on fear and control, but now he was building something else, something that was based on respect and the willingness to grow. Maria had learned to trust again, to believe that people could change. And together, they were creating a future that was no longer defined by the past. It wasn't about control anymore. It wasn't about power. It was about something deeper, something real. The mansion, once a symbol of dominance, now stood as a symbol of redemption, of change, and of the possibility of a better future. Johnny had learned that the true strength of a man wasn't in his ability to control others, but in his ability to control himself, to change, and to build something greater than himself. And Maria had learned that her voice mattered, that she could stand alongside him, not as a servant, but as an equal, helping to shape a future that neither of them had ever expected. Together, they had found something worth fighting for.